The later premise, and that the sensory consciousness arises in dependence upon the sensory organs and the object, follows for the reason that the sensory organ is the one that provides cognitive support for the arising of consciousness. Different modes of consciousness therefore proceed from the alterations in the sensory organs. For instance, when the visual organ is clear and normal, there is a clarity and acuteness in visual perception, whereas there is a visual opaqueness or blurredness when the visual sensory organ is defective and abnormal. Section 3. Sensory organ as specific. The argument from sensory organ as specific or condition, epistemic condition. Here in discussion of Father aggregates again, Chandrakirti claims that the sensory organs are specific or dominant epistemic condition for the production of sensory organs, sensory consciousness. The 5 reasons 5 sensory organs are so-called designated, explains Chandrakirti, since they have the dominance or their respective objects, or the intentional objects of the perception. In this respect, it is the eye which is specifically effective in the apprehension of visual forms, not the visual form. The same principle likewise apply in the case of ears, etc., says Chandrakirti. Chandrakirti's defense of the claim that the sensory organs are dominant epistemic instrument of the sensory organs involve one key argument. The dependency argument, which shows that perceptual consciousness are non-intrinsic, therefore their production is dependent upon the collaborative network of other epistemic instruments, and in particular the 4 conditions out of which the sensory organs are dominant. And the 4 conditions are namely, the dominant condition, that is 5 sensory organs, as they determine the specific character of sensory consciousness, others visual, auditory, and so forth. The second one is a causal condition, that is 5 sensory objects, as they are the causal conditions for the production of sensory consciousness. Third, the intentional objects, or the supportive condition, i.e. the appearance of the objects, the perceptual cognition, where the appearance is the constitutive of the co-dependence of vision, mental images, or the representation. And finally, immediately preceding or directly contiguous condition, that is mental attention drawn towards its intentional object, which enables the cognitive engagement with the object. Applying this dependence argument in the case of visual consciousness, Chandrakirti says that the visual consciousness, which is dependent on the visual sense organ, arises from the appropriation of its conditions, such as visual sense organ, visible form, mental image, and so on. Given that the dependence argument shows that the perceptual consciousness is causally dependent, the task for Chandrakirti is to directly defend the thesis that sense organ is dominant condition, in spite of the fact that there are other conditions at play for the rising of visual consciousness. Just as sound of drum, he says, is so called, for it arises from the drum as a dominance or a specific condition. A sprout of barley is so designated as it arises from the barley seed as a dominant or a specific condition. These are so despite the fact that there are other conditions associated in their production. Even so, argues Chandrakirti, in the case of visual consciousness, for instance, the visual sense organ is designated as a dominant condition in spite of the fact that there are other causal conditions operating or being operated in the production of the visual sense consciousness as the effect. Okay. So that takes me to the 4th. And in fact the last section, which is the longest one. Give that back first. The argument from the emptiness of intrinsic nature of sensory organ as necessary epistemic condition. So this one The last section is pretty long, I hope. Finish in time. At this point, an objection may be raised as follows. What is it that makes Chandrakirti's thesis that each sensory organ is specific or a dominant epistemic condition for the production of their respective sensory consciousness distinctively non-foundational, in contrast with the similar foundationalist thesis put forward by Abhidhammikas, Pramanikas, which Chandrakirti himself rejected. The foundationalist the epistemological foundationalism of Dignaga and Dharmakirti derives the mundane epistemic efficiency of senses as a dominant epistemic condition from the fact that from the fact of the ultimately real intrinsic atoms of sense organs, since the former is said to follow from the latter, given the fact that the causal efficiency is identified as the ultimate truth. From Chandrakirti's point of view, this is an incoherent position to hold. The former does not follow from the latter, since the latter undermines the very possibility of the former. The function of the sense organ as a mundane epistemic instrument is not possible if these atomic particles are reified as ultimately real and intrinsically existent. Whereas the epistemic efficiency of sense organs rests on their ability to create the feedback loops between the constantly changing sensory organs themselves and ever-fleeting ontological structures of the perspective objects, so that the senses are ontologically agile, to be adaptive, to be responsive, in order to be efficient epistemic instruments. The Pramanikas' rigid ontology of sensory organs, given its commitment to foundationalism, does not allow this epistemic flexibility. The Swatantrikas try to avoid this problem. And Swatantrika tries to avoid the problem of Abhidhammikas' rigid ontology by rejecting the intrinsic reality of atoms of the sensory organs, thus denying them as the ultimate truth. Instead, derives the mundane epistemic efficiency of the sensory organ by positing the conventional reality of intrinsically existent atoms of the sensory organs. The former makes sense for the Swatantrika because the ultimate reality of intrinsic atoms of sensory organs is not established through the crucible of critical analysis. The later follows, since intrinsic atoms of sensory organs for Swatantrika are conventional reality as opposed to fiction, for it is proven by the means of conventional analysis, at least according to that. And it is conventional reality of the intrinsic atoms that affords these sensory organs their epistemic efficiency. Chandrakirti's critique of Swatantrika's position reflects that he is still concerned about the unwarranted and inflexible ontological paradigm that Swatantrikas are committed. On Chandrakirti's account, Swatantrika's compromised ontology of the sensory organ that is non-foundational as well as ultimate truth, and foundational at the mundane or conventional truth level, is incoherent. If the atoms of the sensory organs are posited as intrinsically real, whether or not the claim of intrinsic reality is made at the level of ultimate truth or conventional truth, from Chandrakirti's point of view, it would lead to a similar fallacious consequences. Both would undermine the epistemic efficiency of sensory organs. This is so, Chandrakirti argues, for the reason that the sensory organ's intrinsic existence, i.e. conventional truth, and its emptiness, i.e. ultimate truth, are not separated phenomenologically, phenomenally, given the Madhyamika's commitment to the identity of dependent arising emptiness. This being the case, how would sensory organs be intrinsically real, but at the same time empty of intrinsic reality, as the Swatantrikas claim?